Hello ladies and gentlemen, my name is TBSKine, and this is a video about the escalation problem in storytelling, specifically how it applies to shonen manga and anime. What is the escalation problem? Well, Reality Punch Studios have a decent video laying it out, and I've put a link to that in the comments, but if you don't want to watch another video, first here is a super brief TLDR. You know how in a lot of shonen manga the hero has to fight stronger and stronger and stronger enemies all the time until eventually everyone's basically a demigod fighting for the fate of the universe, and it's kind of like the fighting is the only thing that even matters to the story anymore? Yeah, that's the escalation problem. Now in this video I'm going to be talking about the escalation problem specifically as it relates to Bleach. And I chose Bleach because while generally it seems like people think Bleach began to decline at various points after the Soul Society arc, I think the rot began to set in earlier than that. In fact, here. Right here. This is where Bleach begins to unravel as a story. And the reason it unravels is because with this moment, with this storytelling decision, it begins to abandon a major theme that was a big part of why it was interesting to begin with. Now, theme is always kind of tricky to pin down. Most stories don't have just one theme, they have many. But to my mind, fundamentally, the first 50 chapters of Bleach are about grief and the struggle to overcome it. As our story opens, we learn that Ichigo can see ghosts, and despite acting like a tough guy high school punk, he makes a habit out of helping them, hoping he can make it easier for them to cross over to the other side. His family is lively, but clearly dysfunctional, and the specter of his absent mother hangs over the living room, literally, as a giant poster that his scatterbrained father keeps on the wall. Later, in chapter 25, Ichigo has a conversation with his father in front of his mother's grave, and we learn that Ichigo is haunted by survivor's guilt. He was powerless to save his mother and then unable to destroy the Grand Fisher Hollow that consumed her soul, and that guilt is the source of his near-suicidal determination to protect everyone around him at any cost. Ichigo's primary character trait, in other words, comes from his grief at the loss of a loved one. And he is not alone in this. Inoue is an orphan dealing with the death of her brother. Chad, also an orphan, is trying to find himself after the death of his grandfather, and Ishida has become embittered by the death of his master/surrogate father, because it turns out dead parents are a bit of a theme with this story. All of them have had their lives shaped by the deaths of family members, and all of them cope with these losses in much the same way. Ghost busting. Or, well, hollow busting, I suppose. But anyway, my point is, Ichigo becomes a Shinigami to protect his family from a hollow attack, as a direct mirror of how he failed to protect his mother from a hollow attack. Inoue awakens her special flower fairy things, and with them her spirit superpowers, in order to protect her surrogate family of friends from a hollow attack. And Chad awakens his superpowered right arm, protecting a bunch of kids from a hollow attack. Again, you see a theme starting to develop here. There is a direct relationship between the characters' growth as people and the growth of their ability to beat the hollows. They all achieve their powers in a moment of realization that the thing that matters to them more than anything else in the world is to protect the people they care about, protect those people who are still with them. Initially, Ishida kind of seems to be breaking this pattern, because he comes with his ghost-busting spirit powers built in from the start, no epiphany needed. But what you should notice is that the very first thing he does in the story is misuse those powers. He brings a flood of hollows down on the town just so he can show off his Quincy powers and win a meaningless dick-swinging competition with Ichigo. It isn't until he begins to let go of his anger and work with Ichigo, literally protecting his back, that he also begins to process the grief of his master's death. So let's talk about those hollows. It's easy to miss, but they're actually kind of the linchpin that ties the entire thematic of early Bleach together. Because think about what the hollows actually are. They are spirits of the dead that are tied to Earth by the grief of their own deaths, the unresolved issues that they were unable to overcome in life. They become corrupted by pain and suffering, and eventually they turn into monsters that prey on the living. So we have protagonists who are defined by their ability to overcome the grief of death, and we have antagonists, hollows, who are shaped by their inability to overcome the grief of death. And the power of any given character in the narrative is directly measured in their ability to kill hollows. So what Bleach as a story was saying, at least early on, is that grief is awful, and it will devour you if you let it. It can infect you, tear a hole in your chest, chain you to the world, and turn you into a monster. But Bleach is also saying that it doesn't have to be that way. If you hold on to those around you, if you form connections, if you care about other people, the desire to help and heal and protect them will give you the power to overcome grief and exercise it, and that is a pretty powerful theme to build an action story around, at least if you ask me. Which leads us to the Soul Society Ark. because here the themes of the story begin to crumble, because now the enemy isn't hollows anymore. It's other Shinigami fighting with their spirit power. And in the metaphor we've established so far, spirit power is a measure of your ability to resist the grief of death. So when two Shinigami or Quincy's or Fullbringers or whatever fight, that's two people competing to see who's the best at overcoming the death of a loved one? The metaphor breaks down, it doesn't really work anymore, and instead of being a poignant symbol of the inner strength it takes to overcome grief, spirit power becomes just another Dragon Ball power level, a glorified measuring stick for who has got the best superpowers. And yes, that can lead you to some awesome fight scenes and epic training montages, but there's no theme to it except some version of might makes right. And all of this happened to Bleach because of the escalation problem. Because leading up to the Soul Society arc, Bleach had painted itself into a corner. Ichigo had just demonstrated that he could beat back the kaiju-sized super hollow Minos Grande, even in spite of a bunch of exposition explaining that such a thing is surely impossible. No one Shinigami can ever stand up to this monster. And then he did it anyway, and then what are you going to do for the next fight? We've got a manga here where fighting hollows was a key part of the theme, and the tension came from seeing whether the characters could overcome their personal grief, for which the hollows were a metaphor. But Ichigo has just comfortably kicked the ass of the ultimate uber hollow, so there's no tension anymore in just having him fight regular hollows. We know he can beat them, it's not a plausible challenge anymore. So what do you do to keep the story interesting? And the answer Bleach comes up with is, well, I guess he needs to fight something else now, because hollows aren't fun anymore. And so we get the Soul Society arc, and now it's a bunch of Shinigami fighting each other, and training montages, and more Shinigami fights, and now it's Arankars, and Visarts, and Fullbringers, and Quincy's, and none of it has anything to do with the original theme that made the story interesting in the first place. Bleach started out as a manga which asked an incredibly important question of its readers. How do we find peace with the death of loved ones? How do we find peace with grief? These deaths are inevitable in all of our lives, so how do we prevent that loss from turning us into monsters, from devouring us? But because the story has to escalate the stakes, by the time the Soul Society arc rolls around and the arcs that follow it, the only question it's ultimately asking is, who's got the bigger power level? And yeah, sure, maybe that's fun, but without a theme or a bigger question to give it some kind of meaning, fun is all it'll ever be. And when Bleach started out so strong, started out so promising, being just another riff on Dragon Ball was never really gonna cut it. At least for me. Thanks for watching.